Chapter 1, Part 2 of the Influence of Sea Power upon History, 1660 to 1785, by Alfred Thayer Mahan. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 3. Extent of territory. The last of the conditions affecting the development of a nation as a sea power and touching the country itself, as distinguished from the people who dwell there, is extent of territory. This may be dismissed with comparatively few words. As regards the development of sea power, it is not the total number of square miles which a country contains, but the length of its coastline and the character of its harbors that are to be considered. As to these, it is to be said that, the geographical and physical conditions being the same, extent of sea-coast is a source of strength or weakness, according as the population is large or small. A country is in this like a fortress. The garrison must be proportioned to the enceinte. A recent familiar instance is found in the American War of Secession. Had the South had a people as numerous as it was warlike, and a navy commensurate to its other resources as a sea power, the great extent of its sea coast and its numerous inlets would have been elements of great strength. The people of the United States and the government of that day justly prided themselves on the effectiveness of the blockade of the whole southern coast. It was a great feat, a very great feat, but it would have been an impossible feat had the Southerners been more numerous, and a nation of seamen. What was there shown was not, as has been said, how such a blockade can be maintained, but that such a blockade is possible in the face of a population not only unused to the sea, but also scanty in numbers. Those who recall how the blockade was maintained, and the class of ships that blockaded during great part of the war, know that the plan, correct under the circumstances, could not have been carried out in the face of a real navy. Scattered unsupported along the coast, the United States ships kept their places, singly or in small detachments, in face of an extensive network of inland water communications, which favored secret concentration of the enemy. Behind the first line of water communications were long estuaries, and here and there strong fortresses, upon either of which the enemy's ships could always fall back to elude pursuit or to receive protection. Had there been a Southern navy to profit by such advantages, or by the scattered condition of the United States ships, the latter could not have been distributed as they were, and being forced to concentrate for mutual support, many small but useful approaches would have been left open to commerce. But as the southern coast, from its extent and many inlets, might have been a source of strength, so from those very characteristics it became a fruitful source of injury. The great story of the opening of the Mississippi is but the most striking illustration of an action that was going on incessantly all over the South. At every breach of the sea frontier, warships were entering. The streams that had carried the wealth and supported the trade of the seceding States turned against them and admitted their enemies to their hearts. Dismay, insecurity, paralysis prevailed in regions that might, under happier auspices, have kept a nation alive through the most exhausting war. Never did sea power play a greater or a more decisive part than in the contest which determined that the course of the world's history would be modified by the existence of one great nation instead of several rival states in the North American continent. But while just pride is felt in the well-earned glory of those days, and the greatness of the results due to naval preponderance is admitted, Americans who understand the facts should never fail to remind the overconfidence of their countrymen that the South not only had no navy, not only was not a seafaring people, but that also its population was not proportioned to the extent of the sea coast which it had to defend. 4. Number of population. After the consideration of the natural conditions of a country should follow an examination of the characteristics of its population as affecting the development of sea power. And first among these will be taken, because of its relations to the extent of the territory which has just been discussed, the number of the people who live in it. It has been said that in respect of dimensions it is not merely the number of square miles, but the extent and character of the sea coast that is to be considered with reference to sea power. And so, in point of population, it is not only the grand total, but the number following the sea, or at least readily available for employment on shipboard and for the creation of naval material, that must be counted. For example, formerly and up to the end of the great wars following the French Revolution, the population of France was much greater than that of England. But in respect of sea power in general, peaceful commerce as well as military efficiency, France was much inferior to England. In the matter of military efficiency, this fact is the more remarkable because at times, in point of military preparation at the outbreak of war, France had the advantage, but she was not able to keep it. Thus, in 1778, when war broke out, France, through her maritime inscription, was able to man at once 50 ships of the line. England, on the contrary, by reason of the dispersal over the globe of that very shipping on which her naval strength so securely rested, had much trouble in manning 40 at home. But in 1782 she had 120 in commission or ready for commission, while France had never been able to exceed 71. Again, as late as 1840, when the two nations were on the verge of war in the Levant, a most accomplished French officer of the day, while extolling the high state of efficiency of the French fleet and the eminent qualities of its admiral, and expressing confidence in the results of an encounter with an equal enemy, goes on to say, "Behind the squadron of 21 ships of the line which we could then assemble, there was no reserve. Not another ship could have been commissioned within 6 months." And this was due not only to lack of ships and of proper equipments, though both were wanting. "Our maritime inscription," he continues, "was so exhausted by what we had done in manning 21 ships, that the permanent levy established in all quarters did not supply reliefs for the men, who were already more than 3 years on cruise." A contrast such as this shows a difference in what is called staying power, or reserve force, which is even greater than appears on the surface; for a great shipping afloat necessarily employs, besides the crews, a large number of people engaged in the various handicrafts which facilitate the making and repairing of naval material, or following other callings more or less closely connected with the water and with craft of all kinds. Such kindred callings give an undoubted aptitude for the sea from the outset. There is an anecdote showing curious insight into this matter on the part of one of England's distinguished seamen, Sir Edward Pellew. When the war broke out in 1793, the usual scarceness of seamen was met. Eager to get to sea, and unable to fill his complement otherwise than with landsmen, he instructed his officers to seek for Cornish miners, reasoning from the conditions and dangers of their calling, of which he had personal knowledge, that they would quickly fit into the demands of sea life. The result showed his sagacity, for thus escaping an otherwise unavoidable delay, he was fortunate enough to capture the first frigate taken in the war in single combat; and what is especially instructive is, that although but a few weeks in commission, while his opponent had been over a year, the losses, heavy on both sides, were nearly equal. It may be urged that such reserve strength has now nearly lost the importance it once had, because modern ships and weapons take so long to make, and because modern states aim at developing the whole power of their armed force on the outbreak of war with such rapidity as to strike a disabling blow before the enemy can organize an equal effort. To use a familiar phrase, there will not be time for the whole resistance of the national fabric to come into play. The blow will fall on the organized military fleet, and if that yield, the solidity of the rest of the structure will avail nothing. To a certain extent this is true, but then it has always been true, though to a less extent formerly than now. Granted the meeting of two fleets which represent practically the whole present strength of their two nations, if one of them be destroyed while the other remains fit for action, there will be much less hope now than formerly that the vanquished can restore his navy for that war, and the result will be disastrous just in proportion to the dependence of the nation upon her sea power. A Trafalgar would have been a much more fatal blow to England than it was to France, had the English fleet then represented, as the allied fleet did, the bulk of the nation's power. Trafalgar in such a case would have been to England what Austerlitz was to Austria, and Jena to Prussia. An empire would have been laid prostrate by the destruction or disorganization of its military forces, which it is said were the favorite objection of Napoleon. But does the consideration of such exceptional disasters in the past justify the putting a low value upon that reserve strength, based upon the number of inhabitants fitted for a certain kind of military life, which is here being considered? The blows just mentioned were dealt by men of exceptional genius, at the head of armed bodies of exceptional training, esprit de corps, and prestige, and were besides inflicted upon opponents more or less demoralized by conscious inferiority and previous defeat. Austerlitz had been closely preceded by Ulm, where 30,000 Austrians laid down their arms without a battle, and the history of the previous years had been one long record of Austrian reverse and French success. Trafalgar followed closely upon a cruise, justly called a campaign, of almost constant failure; and farther back, but still recent, were the memories of St. Vincent for the Spaniards, and of the Nile for the French in the allied fleet. Except the case of Jena, these crushing overthrows were not single disasters, but final blows; and in the Jena campaign there was a disparity in numbers, equipment, and general preparation for war, which makes it less applicable in considering what may result from a single victory. England is at the present time the greatest maritime nation in the world. In steam and iron she has kept the superiority she had in the days of sail and wood. France and England are the two powers that have the largest military navies, and it is so far an open question which of the two is the more powerful, that they may be regarded as practically of equal strength and material for a sea war. In the case of a collision, can there be assumed such a difference of personnel or of preparation as to make it probable that a decisive inequality will result from one battle or one campaign? If not, the reserve strength will begin to tell. Organized reserve first, then reserve of seafaring population, reserve of mechanical skill, reserve of wealth. It seems to have been somewhat forgotten that England's leadership in mechanical arts gives her a reserve of mechanics, who can easily familiarize themselves with the appliances of modern ironclads; and as her commerce and industries feel the burden of the war, the surplus of seamen and mechanics will go to the armed shipping. The whole question of the value of a reserve, developed or undeveloped, amounts now to this: have modern conditions of warfare made it probable that of two nearly equal adversaries one will be so prostrated in a single campaign that a decisive result will be reached in that time? Sea warfare has given no answer. the crushing successes of Prussia against Austria and of Germany against France appear to have been those of a stronger over a much weaker nation. Whether the weakness were due to natural causes or to official incompetency, how would a delay like that of Plevna have affected the fortune of war had Turkey had any reserve of national power upon which to call? If time be, as is everywhere admitted, a supreme factor in war, it behooves countries whose genius is essentially not military, whose people, like all free people, object to pay for large military establishments, to see to it that they are at least strong enough to gain the time necessary to turn the spirit and capacity of their subjects into the new activities which war calls for. If the existing force by land or sea is strong enough so to hold out, even though at a disadvantage, the country may rely upon its natural resources and strength coming into play for whatever they are worth, its numbers, its wealth, its capacities of every kind. If, on the other hand, what force it has can be overthrown and crushed quickly, the most magnificent possibilities of natural power will not save it from humiliating conditions, nor, if its foe be wise, from guarantees which will postpone revenge to a distant future. The story is constantly repeated on the smaller fields of war. If so and so can hold out a little longer, this can be saved or that can be done. As in sickness, it is often said, if the patient can only hold out so long, the strength of his constitution may pull him through. England, to some extent, is now such a country. Holland was such a country. She would not pay, and if she escaped, it was but by the skin of her teeth. Never in time of peace, and from fear of a rupture, wrote their great statesman De Witt, will they take resolutions strong enough to lead them to pecuniary sacrifices beforehand. The character of the Dutch is such that, unless danger stares them in the face, they are indisposed to lay out money for their own defence. I have to do with a people who, liberal to profusion where they ought to economize, are often sparing to avarice where they ought to spend. That our own country is open to the same reproach is patent to all the world. The United States has not that shield of defensive power behind which time can be gained to develop its reserve of strength. As for a seafaring population adequate to her possible needs, where is it? Such a resource, proportionate to her coastline and population, is to be found only in a national merchant shipping and its related industries, which at present scarcely exist. It will matter little whether the crews of such ships are native or foreign born, provided they are attached to the flag, and her power at sea is sufficient to enable the most of them to get back in case of war. When foreigners by thousands are admitted to the ballot, it is of little moment that they are given fighting room on board ship. Though the treatment of the subject has been somewhat discursive, it may be admitted that a great population following callings related to the sea is, now as formerly, a great element of sea power, that the United States is deficient in that element, and that its foundations can be laid only in a large commerce under her own flag. 5. National character. The effect of national character and aptitudes upon the development of sea power will next be considered. If sea power be really based upon a peaceful and extensive commerce, aptitude for commercial pursuits must be a distinguishing feature of the nations that have at one time or another been great upon the sea. History, almost without exception, affirms that this is true. Save the Romans, there is no marked instance to the contrary. All men seek gain, and more or less love money, but the way in which gain is sought will have a marked effect upon the commercial fortunes and the history of the people inhabiting a country. If history may be believed, the way in which the Spaniards and their kindred nation, the Portuguese, sought wealth, not only brought a blot upon the national character, but was also fatal to the growth of a healthy commerce, and so to the industries upon which commerce lives, and ultimately to that national wealth which was sought by mistaken paths. The desire for gain rose in them to fierce avarice, so they sought in the new found worlds which gave such an impetus to the commercial and maritime development of the countries of Europe, not new fields of industry, not even the healthy excitement of exploration and adventure, but gold and silver. They had many great qualities. They were bold, enterprising, temperate, patient of suffering, enthusiastic, and gifted with intense national feeling. When to these qualities are added the advantages of Spain's position and well-situated ports, the fact that she was first to occupy large and rich portions of the New Worlds and long remained without a competitor, and that for 100 years after the discovery of America she was the leading state in Europe, she might have been expected to take the foremost place among the sea powers. Exactly the contrary was the result, as all know. Since the battle of Lepanto in 1571, though engaged in many wars, no sea victory of any consequence shines on the pages of Spanish history, and the decay of her commerce sufficiently accounts for the painful and sometimes ludicrous inaptness shown on the decks of her ships of war. Doubtless such a result is not to be attributed to one cause only. Doubtless the government of Spain was in many ways such as to cramp and blight a free and healthy development of private enterprise. But the character of a great people breaks through or shapes the character of its government, and it can hardly be doubted that had the bent of the people been toward trade, the action of government would have been drawn into the same current. The great field of the colonies also was remote from the centre of that despotism which blighted the growth of old Spain. As it was, thousands of Spaniards of the working as well as the upper classes left Spain, and the occupations in which they engaged abroad sent home little but specie, or merchandise of small bulk, requiring but small tonnage. The mother country herself produced little but wool, fruit, and iron. Her manufactures were naught, her industries suffered, her population steadily decreased. Both she and her colonies depended upon the Dutch for so many of the necessaries of life that the products of their scanty industries could not suffice to pay for them. "So that Holland merchants," writes a contemporary, "who carry money to most parts of the world to buy commodities, must out of this single country of Europe carry home money which they receive in payment of their goods." Thus their eagerly sought emblem of wealth passed quickly from their hands. It has already been pointed out how weak from a military point of view Spain was from this decay of her shipping. Her wealth being in small bulk, on a few ships, following more or less regular routes, was easily seized by an enemy, and the sinews of war paralyzed; whereas the wealth of England and Holland, scattered over thousands of ships in all parts of the world, received many bitter blows in many exhausting wars without checking a growth which, though painful, was steady. The fortunes of Portugal, united to Spain during a most critical period of her history, followed the same downward path. Although foremost in the beginning of the race for development by sea, she fell utterly behind. The mines of Brazil were the ruin of Portugal, as those of Mexico and Peru had been of Spain. All manufactures fell into insane contempt. Ere long the English supplied the Portuguese not only with clothes, but with all merchandise, all commodities, even to salt fish and grain. After their gold, the Portuguese abandoned their very soil. The vineyards of Oporto were finally bought by the English with Brazilian gold, which had only passed through Portugal to be spread throughout England. We are assured that in 50 years $500 millions were extracted from the mines of Brazil, and that at the end of the time Portugal had but 25 millions in specie, a striking example of the difference between real and fictitious wealth. The English and Dutch were no less desirous of gain than the southern nations. Each in turn has been called a nation of shopkeepers, but the jeer, in so far as it is just, is to the credit of their wisdom and uprightness. They were no less bold, no less enterprising, no less patient. Indeed, they were more patient, in that they sought riches not by the sword, but by labor, which is the reproach meant to be implied by the epithet, for thus they took the longest, instead of what seemed the shortest, road to wealth. But these two peoples, radically of the same race, had other qualities no less important than those just named, which combined with their surroundings to favor their development by sea. They were by nature business men, traders, producers, negotiators. Therefore, both in their native country and abroad, whether settled in the ports of civilized nations, or of barbarous Eastern rulers, or in colonies of their own foundation, they everywhere strove to draw out all the resources of the land, to develop and increase them. The quick instinct of the born trader, shopkeeper, if you will, sought continually new articles to exchange, and this search, combined with the industrious character evolved through generations of labor, made them necessarily producers. At home they became great as manufacturers; abroad, where they controlled, the land grew richer continually, products multiplied, and the necessary exchange between home and the settlements called for more ships. Their shipping therefore increased with these demands of trade, and nations with less aptitude for maritime enterprise, even France herself, great as she has been, called for their products and for the service of their ships. Thus in many ways they advanced to power at sea. This natural tendency and growth were indeed modified and seriously checked at times by the interference of other governments, jealous of a prosperity which their own people could invade only by the aid of artificial support, a support which will be considered under the head of governmental action as affecting sea power. The tendency to trade, involving of necessity the production of something to trade with, is the national characteristic most important to the development of sea power. Granting it and a good seaboard, it is not likely that the dangers of the sea, or any aversion to it, will deter a people from seeking wealth by the paths of ocean commerce. Where wealth is sought by other means it may be found, but it will not necessarily lead to sea power. Take France. France has a fine country, an industrious people, an admirable position. The French navy has known periods of great glory, and in its lowest estate has never dishonored the military reputation so dear to the nation. Yet as a maritime state, securely resting upon a broad basis of sea commerce, France, as compared with other historical sea peoples, has never held more than a respectable position. The chief reason for this, so far as national character goes, is the way in which wealth is sought. As Spain and Portugal sought it by digging gold out of the ground, the temper of the French people leads them to seek it by thrift, economy, hoarding. It is said to be harder to keep than to make a fortune, possibly; but the adventurous temper, which risks what it has to gain more, has much in common with the adventurous spirit that conquers worlds for commerce. The tendency to save and put aside, to venture timidly and on a small scale, may lead to a general diffusion of wealth on a like small scale, but not to the risks and development of external trade and shipping interests. To illustrate, and the incident is given only for what it is worth, a French officer speaking to the author about the Panama Canal said, "I have 2 shares in it. In France we don't do as you, where a few people take a great many shares each. With us, a large number of people take one share, or a very few. When these were in the market, my wife said to me, "You take 2 shares, one for you and one for me." As regards the stability of a man's personal fortunes, this kind of prudence is doubtless wise. But when excessive prudence or financial timidity becomes a national trait, it must tend to hamper the expansion of commerce and of the nation's shipping. The same caution in money matters, appearing in another relation of life, has checked the production of children, and keeps the population of France nearly stationary. The noble classes of Europe inherited from the Middle Ages a supercilious contempt for peaceful trade, which has exercised a modifying influence upon its growth, according to the national character of different countries. The pride of the Spaniards fell easily in with this spirit of contempt, and cooperated with that disastrous unwillingness to work and wait for wealth, which turned them away from commerce. In France, the vanity which is conceded, even by Frenchmen, to be a national trait led in the same direction. The numbers and brilliancy of the nobility, and the consideration enjoyed by them, set a seal of inferiority upon an occupation which they despised. Rich merchants and manufacturers sighed for the honours of nobility, and upon obtaining them abandoned their lucrative professions. Therefore, while the industry of the people and the fruitfulness of the soil saved commerce from total decay, it was pursued under a sense of humiliation which caused its best representatives to escape from it as soon as they could. Louis XIV., under the influence of Colbert, put forth an ordinance authorizing all noblemen to take an interest in merchant ships, goods, and merchandise, without being considered as having derogated from nobility, provided they did not sell at retail. And the reason given for this action was that it imports the good of our subjects and our own satisfaction to efface the relic of a public opinion, universally prevalent, that maritime commerce is incompatible with nobility. But a prejudice involving conscious and open superiority is not readily effaced by ordinances, especially when vanity is a conspicuous trait in national character, and many years later Montesquieu taught that it is contrary to the spirit of monarchy that the nobility should engage in trade. In Holland there was a nobility, but the state was republican in name, allowed large scope to personal freedom and enterprise, and the centres of power were in the great cities. The foundation of the national greatness was money, or rather wealth. Wealth, as a source of civic distinction, carried with it also power in the state, and with power there went social position and consideration. In England the same result obtained. The nobility were proud, but in a representative government the power of wealth could be neither put down nor overshadowed. It was patent to the eyes of all, it was honoured by all, and in England as well as Holland the occupations which were the source of wealth shared in the honour given to wealth itself. Thus, in all the countries named, social sentiment, the outcome of national characteristics, had a marked influence upon the national attitude toward trade. In yet another way does the national genius affect the growth of sea power in its broadest sense, and that is in so far as it possesses the capacity for planting healthy colonies. Of colonization, as of all other growths, it is true that it is most healthy when it is most natural. Therefore, colonies that spring from the felt wants and natural impulses of a whole people will have the most solid foundations, and their subsequent growth will be surest when they are least trammelled from home, if the people have the genius for independent action. Men of the past 3 centuries have keenly felt the value to the mother country of colonies as outlets for the home products and as a nursery for commerce and shipping. But efforts at colonization have not had the same general origin, nor have different systems all had the same success. The efforts of statesmen, however far-seeing and careful, have not been able to supply the lack of strong natural impulse, nor can the most minute regulation from home produce as good results as a happier neglect, when the germ of self-development is found in the national character. There has been no greater display of wisdom in the national administration of successful colonies than in that of unsuccessful. Perhaps there has been even less. If elaborate system and supervision, careful adaptation of means to ends, diligent nursing could avail for colonial growth, the genius of England has less of this systematizing faculty than the genius of France. But England, not France, has been the great colonizer of the world. Successful colonization, with its consequent effect upon commerce and sea power, depends essentially upon national character, because colonies grow best when they grow of themselves naturally. The character of the colonist, not the care of the home government, is the principle of the colony's growth. This truth stands out the clearer because the general attitude of all the home governments toward their colonies was entirely selfish. However founded, as soon as it was recognized to be of consequence, the colony became to the home country a cow to be milked, to be cared for, of course, but chiefly as a piece of property valued for the returns it gave. Legislation was directed toward a monopoly of its external trade. The places in its government afforded posts of value for occupants from the mother country, and the colony was looked upon, as the sea still so often is, as a fit place for those who were ungovernable or useless at home. The military administration, however, so long as it remains a colony, is the proper and necessary attribute of the home government. The fact of England's unique and wonderful success as a great colonizing nation is too evident to be dwelt upon, and the reason for it appears to lie chiefly in two traits of the national character. The English colonist naturally and readily settles down in his new country, identifies his interests with it, and though keeping an affectionate remembrance of the home from which he came, has no restless eagerness to return. In the second place, the Englishman at once and instinctively seeks to develop the resources of the new country in the broadest sense. In the former particular he differs from the French, who were ever longingly looking back to the delights of their pleasant land; in the latter, from the Spaniards, whose range of interest and ambition was too narrow for the full evolution of the possibilities of a new country. The character and the necessities of the Dutch led them naturally to plant colonies, and by the year 1650 they had in the East Indies, in Africa, and in America a large number, only to name which would be tedious. They were then far ahead of England in this matter, but though the origin of these colonies, purely commercial in its character, was natural, there seems to have been lacking to them a principle of growth. In planting them, they never sought an extension of empire, but merely an acquisition of trade and commerce. They attempted conquest only when forced by the pressure of circumstances. Generally, they were content to trade under the protection of the sovereign of the country. This placid satisfaction with gain alone, unaccompanied by political ambition, tended, like the despotism of France and Spain, to keep the colonies mere commercial dependencies upon the mother country, and so kill the natural principle of growth. Before quitting this head of the inquiry, it is well to ask how far the national character of Americans is fitted to develop a great sea power, should other circumstances become favorable. It seems scarcely necessary, however, to do more than appeal to a not very distant past, to prove that, if legislative hindrances be removed, and more remunerative fields of enterprise filled up, the sea power will not long delay its appearance. The instinct for commerce, bold enterprise in the pursuit of gain, and a keen scent for the trails that lead to it, all exist; and if there be in the future any fields calling for colonization, it cannot be doubted that Americans will carry to them all their inherited aptitude for self-government and independent growth. End of Chapter 1, Part 2.